this place has been like a salvation for me too, like a safe harbor in the concrete jungle of New York. And it's a place where I feel like I got to turn to every time I am in pain, I'm in sorrow, I am gasping for air. And had it is if it were not for this very simple place, small here on 43rd Street, with unpretentious friends and unpretentious studies, I wouldn't be able to survive in this city. And I think that's true for a lot of us that are here. So I am eternally grateful for this place that we call Inner Enlightenment, and for all the people that are part of it that make it a community of Christ. So thank you so much, guys, for this opportunity. And I pray to Jesus to be able to convey the message as he would want us to receive in the 4th chapter of the book, The Good News. So for the sake of those that are watching and are not very familiar with this book, we're going to say very briefly what it is. The spirit Humberto de Campos, who was a journalist in Brazil, when he discarnated, he went to the spirit world, and he, very soon after discarnating, he contacted the medium Chico Xavier, who channeled more than 400 books, thousands of messages, with the intent to transmit a lot of teachings through his mediumship. And one of the books that is one of the most popular books that he wrote through the hands of Chico was The Good News, Boa Nova in Portuguese. Our friends from the Spirited Society of Virginia, Kardec Radio, Vanessa Anceloni, and her whole community there have been very diligently working to translate this book, and they've already submitted this manuscript to Brazil, and the Brazilian Spiritist Federation is in the process of editing, revising, and hopefully this will be published in English very soon, so we'll have a chance to read the book in English. So this book is 30 moments in the gospel message. And Humberto de Campos sort of broadens our horizon by taking us behind the scenes of what was happening during the day of a very famous parable and afterwards, and takes us to the emotional state of the disciples and the emotional state of the crowd, which helps us to understand why Jesus said what he said in the way that he said. So we had last month, our friend Thelma had the 3rd chapter of the book, where she described the master calling Peter and Andrew in the shores of Galilee. And this chapter talks about exactly that. Jesus recruiting 2 more of his very important apostles, James and John, who were brothers, John the evangelist and James, who are the sons of Zebedee. Now, the title of the lecture of this chapter is very appropriate, because we're going to see that Humberto de Campos gives a very detailed profile on every single member of the Zebedee family: the father, the 2 sons, and Zebedee's mother, Zebedee's wife, Salome. So that's why Humberto de Campos titled it Zebedee's family. Now, this chapter particularly has a very long dialogue between Zebedee and Jesus. And there are so many amazing insights into it that I tried my best to synthesize in a lecture format, and I'm hoping that I don't go over time. And I will ask for your participation to make it a little more fun and interactive by inviting you to read what's going to be on the screen. So we're going to get right to it so we can take advantage of the time. So just like Peter and Andrew, who were fishing by the shores of Lake Galilee and were called by the master to be fishermen of souls instead of fishermen of fish, Jesus is the same thing to James and John the evangelist. And they were very young at the time. And I'm going to read the narrative here so that we can feel. The idea is for us really to feel the moment, to really transport ourselves back then and see ourselves in the narrative, like we were watching a movie and we were inside of it. So as you can see, this is in the morning. And Humberto sets up the chapter by saying the following: the morning after the first public talk outside the town of Tiberias, the master approached 2 young men who were fishing by the shore and invited them to join his apostolate. So this is the day after Jesus' very first public talk. So he approaches and he says, "Sons of Zebedee," in a kind way, "would you like to take part in the joys of the good news?" Now imagine we're there fishing with our father, and we see person we recognize with this tremendous kindness and love radiating, and what would we respond? How would we react to that invitation? And this is how they react. James and John, who already knew the preachings of the Baptist and had heard him the night before, were filled with excitement. So they were already being prepared for this call by listening to the preachings of John the Baptist. This is important to know because John the Baptist was a very energetic announcer of the coming of the Messiah. And he was already preaching everywhere in the region. And a lot of the Jewish people were looking at him as a very important prophet. And they were seeing in him a source of consolation and hope. Because remember, the Jewish people were being oppressed by the Romans. So they were very excited and eager with these promises that John the Baptist was giving to them. So when they see the Master come, they were filled with excitement. And overjoyed, they rushed to him and exclaimed happily, "Master, Master." This is a moment where you see Zebedee the father with his employees and the sons when Jesus approaches the shores of Galilee to invite them. Now, here he describes the relationship between Jesus, James, and John. It was as if they were beloved brothers who had been reunited after a long time apart, touched by the power of love that radiated from Christ. And I like what Humberto de Campos uses to describe this, the power of love that radiated from Christ. And he describes an inspiring source of deepest dedication. Isn't that beautiful? An inspiring source of deepest dedication. And indeed is a dedication, right? This is a spirit that has been dedicated to all of the human family incarnated in this planet for billions of years and has been working diligently for the liberation and the spiritual growth of every single creature that God entrusted to him to be on this planet. We're talking over 20 billion souls, right? Big human family to be dedicated to. So they talked at length about their enduring union, about the future, about the hope that would carry them forward in the days ahead while they proclaimed the beauties of the endeavor through the gospel of the kingdom. So immediately when they received the call, they were overjoyed and they yielded to the call. And this is a lesson in and of itself for us to reflect on. And I'm going to draw a lot of my reflections that I prepared for tonight's lecture from a work called The Wisdom of the Gospel, which is not available in English, Sabedoria do Evangelho, by the Brazilian scholar Carlos Torres Pastorino, who spoke Italian, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, spoke all of the dead languages, and was a profound scholar of the New Testament and Old Testament. And in The Wisdom of the Gospel, he goes deep into defining every word, what it meant in the cultural context of the time. So there's a lot of rich information and insights that he gathers from there. So this is the source of deep dedication. As they're talking and they're already making plans for this very beautiful horizon that's stretching out before them. Now, immediately when they were called, they received. And what Pastorino talks about is the difference between the individuality and the personality. The gospel is a set of material and information aimed at the individuality. What's the individuality? It's the immortal spirit that resides in the body, and that has nothing to do with the physical body. And what's the personality? The personality is all the things that animate the current persona of Fred, Sonia, Ed. We identify them and identify ourselves by the personalities, right? Where you're from, color of skin, if you're tall, if you're short, if you're bald, if you're not. All of these things have to do with the personality, and they stay in the body. They have nothing to do with the immortal spirit. So the gospel is a set of callings for the individuality, or in other words, for the immortal spirit, to have enough strength to triumph over the calls of the personality. So when we see James and John immediately saying, "Yes, Master," and already in this joyful exchange, making plans for the future, we see in them how receptive their spirits were to the message. And their personalities as James and John, sons of Zebedee, sons of Salome from Galilee, didn't seem to be as important, didn't seem to be as something that made him attach or made him think, wait, my father is a fisherman, he owns a fisher company, we're going to abandon him, what are we going to do? None of those thoughts crossed their minds. They immediately answered the call of the master. So this is a lesson already for us to reflect on how willing are we whenever we are receiving these calls, which we receive every day, right? Now he describes the temperament of James and John. Remember, they were very young. The two young Galileans had passionate temperaments. Deeply generous, their souls were loving, simple, warm, and sincere. I'm going to repeat those because we're going to reflect on them later. Their souls were loving, simple, warm, and sincere. I especially like to pause on sincerity of feelings, sincerity of emotions, which is something that the personality tries to disguise so much, tries to wear masks, right? Out of fear, out of being judged. So there's not a lot of emotional sincerity, emotional honesty. We feel things, but we don't let them come out to the outside, to the people around us because we are afraid. So we do a lot of editing of ourselves, right? And here it shows they were warm, simple, loving, simple, warm, and sincere. So John took the Lord's hands and kissed him affectionately, while Jesus stroked his soft curly hair. Now John would become known as the beloved apostle, and he was one of 4 that wrote the gospel. There were hundreds of individuals that wrote gospels, but the ones that we inherited and that are more known are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And John is known to have written what a lot of scholars call the pneumatic gospel. Pneumatic comes from pneuma, which means soul, or the spiritual gospel. Whereas Mark was writing more for the Romans, Matthew was writing more for the Jews, and Luke was trying to make sense of all the information that he received in a very diligent Greek way that he was, academic, doctor. He was following Paul around, and so he was able to extract all the teachings of Paul and put it into a very systematically organized gospel. So those are the 4 gospels that we see are directed and aimed to different audiences and different angles, right? And John writes what people call the pneumatic, the gospel, the spiritual gospel, where there's a lot of symbolism, where there's a lot of depth in the way it was written. Now, we see also that both James and John are going to be very important characters in the gospel message and responsible for its surviving. And we're going to see how that plays out later. So as if willing to pledge his full solidarity, James approached the Messiah and put his right hand on his shoulder, showing loving devotion. And we're going to see how James becomes very devoted and very loyal to the gospel message, to the point of ensuring the survival of the church of the way in Jerusalem, because he was able to be that intermediator between the Sanhedrin and the followers of the good news, the way, because he adhered strictly to the Jewish principles. And because of his adherence to the Jewish principles in a very strict way, he was able to appease the Sanhedrin, do kind of like a good diplomacy, good neighborhood diplomacy, which allowed them to keep the church open. So, though the 2 new apostles were still very young, so now we're back to that call by the shores of Galilee. And in the gospel itself, not in the good news, this passage of the calling of Peter and Andrew, which Humberto talks in the previous chapter, and the call of James and John happens consecutively. And afterwards it says, then they went down into Capernaum. Capernaum is the city that Peter, Simon lived, and it was the stage where a lot of the preachings and the ministry of Jesus takes place. Now, what I love about Pastorino is that he is able to give us glimpses about the meanings of words. And when we examine the meanings of words, we see a whole other layer of understanding of the gospel. So, for example, do you know what the word Galilee means? In the original Aramaic, enclosed garden. Where is the kingdom of heaven that Jesus mentions all the time? It's in the heart. So Galilee being an enclosed garden, a shielded garden, is like resembling the heart, where we work and toil to make the seeds of the good news blossom. And what does Capernaum mean in Aramaic? City of the Consoler. Literally, city of the Comforter. So when they say that they went down to Capernaum and went into the city, after they were called, they immediately went to console. They immediately went to begin comforting people. It's very beautiful, right? Especially because in the previous chapter, we see that Jesus goes all the way up to Jerusalem to look at the highest intellectual scholars of the law at the time in order to try to persuade them to join. But they couldn't see in Jesus the Messiah. They saw a poor Galilean with dirty clothes from the travel, and they scorned him. Even though he displayed tremendous wisdom to them, they were still mocking him. So then he goes down, which is a symbol of humility, back to the Galilee area, the enclosed garden of the heart, to find those of goodwill. And then he takes James and John in this chapter, and they go down to Capernaum to console, to comfort. Beautiful, right? So they were just called, they were at the beach. They are overjoyed. They rush home to tell their mother. They return home with their spirits taken in by immense joy, and they reported to their mother everything that had happened. Remember about sincerity? They were sincere. They were overjoyed. They just transparently reported everything that happened to the mother. Now we begin to get a glimpse on Mom Salome. Although she was, this is that I'm going to read is not there, immense joy, and they reported everything to the mother. Although she was a kind and sensitive person, Salome, Zebedee's wife, received the news cautiously. She also had heard the prophet from Nazareth with his glorious affirmations the evening before. Now, this is important. She also was adequately prepared. She also received some of the message in the same way that James and John were receiving it from John the Baptist. Salome was also present the night before when Jesus gave his first public talk. So she knew this man, she knew the Messiah, she knew the prophet, she was aware of who James and John were talking about. Now here comes a second insight and a lesson for us. So she started to ask herself. So Humberto de Campos shows us an inner dialogue that takes place with Salome. Who wants to read so that I don't bore you to death with my voice? Anybody? Teresa?
So she started to ask herself, wouldn't that kingdom promised by Jesus be coming soon? What if the son of Mary was in the city talking on behalf of some prince? Christ must be the intermediary for an unknown noble who was recruiting followers among the hardworking and strongest men, to whom would be entrusted the highest positions in the new institution. Her dear sons deserve them. She should act fast while there was still time.
What was the motivation of Salome in this inner dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, the way I read it, it's almost like, hey, they can have a great position in this new organization, or whatever you want to call it, this effort, and Jesus is recruiting people that they're going to be following a prince and doing his work.
Recruiting, position, ambition. Muriel read the opening passage, victims of ambition, right? She's being a victim of her own ambition in this moment by misunderstanding the news she had received. And as a good mother that cares for her children, thinks in an immediate way for the sake of their son's personality, not the individual spirit that inhabits in them, right? So she immediately gets rushed into this excitement, and what does she do? She goes out. And it says here that she should fast while there's still time. The people had been talking about a revolution against the Romans for a long time now. And the most indiscreet commentators foresaw that Herod Antipas was going to fall soon. The new kingdom was near. Overwhelmed by her maternal dreams, she looks for the Messiah in the circle of the first disciples. So the people had been talking about a revolution against the Romans for a long time. I see in this not just a historical accurate depiction of the Jewish people foreseeing a revolution against the Romans, but also a revolution against what? The material supremacy. Because Rome is the symbol of materialism at its best, at its strongest. Materialism with all of its excesses. And a revolution against the Romans means a revolution of values against the material world's interests. What? The spiritual interests, right? So the message of the good news is there happening with Christ incarnated. This revolution against Rome really means also a revolution against matter, so that the spirit can thrive over it, right? So she goes and looks for the Messiah in the circle of the first disciples. And then as she arrives, now let's picture this. In the gospel itself, it shows that this woman arrives and she kneels in front of the master, very reverently and very respectfully, and she doesn't say anything. She just stays there kneeling. And the master waits. And then he says to her, "Woman, what can I help you with? What would you like?" And then she said, "Lord, right after the establishment of your kingdom, I would like to have my son sitting by you, one on your right and one on your left, as the noblest figures of your throne." I love that this is a very insight. Right after all the unnecessary, trivial, unimportant hard work of establishing the organization, after that, boring stuff takes place. When it's finally there, ready for the people to see, then I want you to get my sons and put them on your right and on the left in the highest positions. All about ambitions, all about power, thirsting for power.
Plus it also has the idea of the doubt. If you don't do it, I don't want them involved. If you're a success, then I want my sons associated.
Exactly. Because she's seeing that this is in the air. All of the community around is talking about it. She is related to Mary. They're sisters, according to Pastorino. So that's why she says the son of Mary is going around Galilee talking about this thing. So she's like, okay, I better take advantage of this so that we could, make sure our children are well positioned, right? According to Pastorino, they were connected as cousin nephews. This is what a lot of scholars of the gospel speculate.
Jesus and John and James.
According to them, yes, John and James would be almost like cousin nephews of Jesus by way of Salome's connection with Mary.
His mother.
Yeah. But this is all what the scholars and the academics that study the gospel, they speculate. There's not a specific assertion that says one way or another. But when we see that James and John, according to Humberto de Campos, meet, and they're like a long lost brother and like a family, there's a hint about it. But that's really not really important for the purposes of what we're studying here, right? But it's good to see that they had some connection. So this passage in the gospel, Jesus takes advantage of this to make a huge lesson of woman, that's not, at the end he says, it's really not up to me whether they'll be on the right or the left. It's up to my Father who is in heaven, right? But we're going to see that later. So this is how Jesus reacts, and this is how the message comes for us. Jesus smiled and replied respectfully. First of all, we need to know if they, James and John, will choose to drink of my cup. He's not saying, first of all, we need to know if they want, if they're going or not going, if they will choose. Free will. He's very careful about emphasizing that part. When he responds that, she gets very embarrassed because she realizes, remember, she goes where the first disciples are. Peter and Andrew are there. Peter is also a very sincere personality, very transparent. And in the gospel, at the end, it shows that the other disciples turn against the woman and James and John because they're going, this is outrageous. This woman just storms in here and asks for her sons to be put on the right and the left in highest positions. What about us? We've already been here with him earlier, right? So the cup, big symbol. In the Old Testament, the cup is usually associated with something related to bitterness, something of struggle, of sorrow. One or two passages in the Psalms show it in a joyful way. In the Psalm 23, it says, my cup overflows. That's in cup overflows with joy. But for the most part, it's a symbol for something bitter. Now, the way the gospel is written, there's also a understanding of if they're going to drink of my cup related to the sense of immersing themselves. Are they going to immerse themselves in the same way that I have been immersed myself in this trial? So it's very beautiful because Christ, as he says that, he's already hinting at what he would foresee as the fate of both of them. Because when he asks the mother and the sons, there's a discrepancy in the gospel, because in one gospel it only shows that the mother is there. In the other gospel, I think it's Matthew, it shows that the mother with the two children are there. But the point is, when he asks, we need to know if they will choose to drink of my cup, they immediately respond, yes, they can. And Jesus, kindly, indulgent, he says, because he clearly realized he didn't understand what cup he was talking about, he says, well, in truth, they will drink of my cup. They will, because in fact they do. James, this cup of bitterness, of sacrifice, James in the year 42 will be beheaded in Jerusalem for the sake of the gospel message. And John, who is the only apostle who dies of natural causes in the island of Patmos, he, before is exiled to the island, he's immersed in a cauldron of hot boiling oil. And so he burns himself as he's immersed in this hot boiling oil, and then he's exiled to the island of Patmos, where he's going to write probably the most important body of work that he wrote, which is the book of Revelations, the Apocalypse, which was a mediumistic work. This is a moment where this soul left its body, went into the spirit realm, experienced what must have been an incredibly rich interaction with a lot of spirits, and comes back and writes everything. So literally, John was immersed in this cup of pain and struggle. So that's why Jesus says, yes, they will drink from it. But it's whether they're going to be on the right or the left is not up to me. It's up to my Father. Which even shows a proof that Jesus could not have been God as one person. And that's what Pastorino argues. For other faiths that are Christian faiths that argue that Jesus and God were one and the same, this is one passage that shows, wait, if that's the case, how come then Jesus doesn't know what the Father does? Isn't he the Father, right? So it shows that it's two different beings. So far so good? Questions? Thelma, looks like you have questions.
No, I'm good.
Okay. So,
I think
yeah.
also wasn't, and I think a lot of people had the idea at the time that there would be a temporal king. You know, they were looking for
Power on the earth.
right power on the earth, so it's very understandable that she would.
Exactly. She was thinking of a physical, material revolution. That's why she really wanted this establishment of the kingdom to happen and her kids to be there, right? She wasn't thinking spiritually. So when she realizes at that moment that the way Jesus responds makes her feel embarrassed, Humberto de Campos says she left quickly and went back and told her elderly husband what had happened. So now we get a little bit of a glimpse on Zebedee. And by the way, I put this image here because Salome also had the seeds of the gospel in her heart and in her individuality. And even though in this moment she acts in a way of a mother trying to be anxious about physical positions of power, she is a devout follower of Jesus, because in the end, when he's crucified, she's one of the women that's there by the foot of the cross, courageously helping Mary with John the Evangelist, mother and son here, along with the other women. So she's a very, very devout woman. It's very important not to dismiss her as this woman that is just wanting to get her kids' positions, right? She develops spiritually in a beautiful way. So she goes home, she talks to Zebedee, and Zebedee, like the noble man that he was, the patriarch of the family, understands what happens, and he goes sees Jesus. Because remember, he was at the shores of Galilee fishing when he saw what happened, and he stayed on the boat. In the gospel it says Zebedee stayed behind with the employees. Another important point, which is often we don't realize, Peter, Simon, and Zebedee were business partners. They owned the same fishing company, which means that they were financially very comfortable, which means that they were able to follow the master before they were being called as apostles, by following the Baptist around, so that when they were called, they left possessions behind. So it was kind of a struggle because they had possessions. But at the same time, it shows that James and John were honorable too, knowing that they could leave behind the fishing company, knowing that Zebedee had employees working for him. Now, Pastorino goes into another interpretation of this by saying Zebedee stayed behind with the employees, dealing with fish, meaning Zebedee stayed behind to take care of the physical things, along with the employees, meaning the inferior vehicles of the body, tending to those needs. It's very, very interesting the way he interprets that. So Zebedee listens to his wife and takes the two children and goes to Simon's house. Simon Peter, Zebedee's business partner. They knew each other. They were friends. So he goes. He knows that the master is there. There's no insecurity or shyness going to the stranger's house. No, they were business partners. They knew each other. So upon entering, this is how beautiful. Jesus welcomes them with extreme kindness, while the old Galilean explained his reasons for coming with humility and respect. Imagine Jesus, what would be like an extreme kindness being displayed by a person like Jesus? It must leave us overjoyed, must make us feel so embraced, so welcomed, right? So comforted. And as he's explaining to Jesus why he came, Jesus says, Zebedee, you know the law and you keep the commandments in your heart. Do you know any prophet of God who during his time on the earth came to be loved by the people of the world? Do you know anyone during his time who came to be loved by the people of the world? Of the world. This is an important preposition. Not in the world, but of the world, meaning connected to the values of the material world. And he responds, no, Lord. What did they do to Moses, Jeremiah, and Jonah? All emissaries of the divine truth were mistreated and slaughtered, or they were banished from the place where they were born. That's very painful, right? To be banished from the place you were born, to be banished from the community that you grew up in, for everything that makes your personality resonate with belonging, feeling loved, feeling embraced, banished from the community. Meaning, this person is too much of a revolutionary. We can't accept them. We got to toss them aside. Then he says, on earth, the price of love and truth has been martyrdom and death. I love how he says the price of love and truth has been. He doesn't say the price of love and truth will always be. Has been, so far, martyrdom and death. But he leaves open the possibility that in the future, it won't have to be this way. Right? So, as he's telling this to Zebedee, he's listening to him humbly and he repeats, yes, Lord. So there's, in the next few passages, there's going to be a lot of insights that Jesus shares here. So I tried to put them into entertaining slides so that we don't fall asleep. And there's a lot of really good lessons here for us. And Humberto says, as if taking advantage of the moment to clarify everything that was doubtful, Jesus continued. The kingdom of God needs to be established in the hearts of all men. Hard work is my joy. Suffering is my cup. But my spirit is illuminated by the sacred assurance of victory. So the cup is full of gall, it's bitter. And the hard work is his joy, is what actually makes him feel good. But at the bottom of it all, the spirit is illuminated by the sacred assurance of victory. That speaks about faith, right? And that reminds us, how is our faith? How often do we check in with ourselves regarding the state of our faith, of our trust in God, in us, in our community, right? So he says, Zebedee respectively explained, Lord, your kingdom is the kingdom of peace and resignation, for which all believers of Elijah were waiting. So he's making a commentary of the Old Testament passage, probably a very well-known passage that was studied and discussed by the doctors of the law. Your kingdom is the kingdom of peace and resignation, for which all believers of Elijah were waiting. And remember, Elijah is the same spirit that animates the personality of John the Baptist. Same spirit that comes back, right? Now, Jesus here starts to clarify things, because probably this passage of Elijah in the Old Testament was being misinterpreted. Kingdom of peace and resignation. So Jesus, with a benign smile, he adds, the peace of a pure conscience and the absolute resignation to my Father's will are of my kingdom. The peace of a pure conscience and the absolute resignation of my Father's will are of my kingdom. But people often talk about a kind of peace that is an idleness of the spirit. They also talk about people experiencing a sense of resignation, which is an addiction within the realm of feelings. Wow. It's a very complex notion to wrap our brains around, right? He's definitely making a commentary that this passage of Elijah, peace and resignation, was probably being misunderstood, and people were looking at a piece of this peace, idyllic peace, material comforts, health, everybody's doing fine, delights of and the material delights, and that's the peace we want. And probably having to do with a king that is the sovereign of the Jewish people. They're not burdened by any oppressor. That's the peace we want. And the resignation, an addiction within the realm of feelings. Took me a long time to say, oh my God, what is he talking about here? Addiction within the realm of feelings. So here's some things I came up with, and feel free to agree or disagree, toss it aside. So how do we achieve the peace of a pure conscience? Following God's laws.
We can begin by doing self-knowledge.
Self-knowledge, right, Rudy? How about doing our duties every day, fulfilling our obligations? And when we put our heads in the pillow at night after a long, hard day's work, don't we feel that, that was a good day today? That's the peace of a pure conscience. A conscience can only be at peace when it has been purified by the hard work, by the obligations and the duties we have to fulfill. If we begin to neglect them in any way, does our conscience remain at peace? It may, for a person that's still in a very early stage of spiritual development, meaning they're unaware of it. But as the conscience develops and becomes aware, once it lights up and we continue to neglect duties, our conscience doesn't leave us alone. It doesn't leave us at peace, right? So that's how I read it. It's the fulfilling of our daily obligations. And then sense of resignation, addiction within the realm of feelings. The way I read this is a resignation that's based on a foundation of fear, of insecurity, of indifference, of apathy. So things around me are very turbulent and complicated, and I have the power within me to be an agent of positive change. And I don't care. I am indifferent to it. It's going to go away. I'm afraid. Maybe I don't even admit it to myself, but I'm afraid of dealing with it. So I'll be resigned. I'll just be resigned. Right? Almost like Pontius Pilate going like this. You know? I think this is what he means in this sense of resignation. It's not an active, courageous resignation that knows how to wait, that knows how to accept things and work with it, even when we don't agree, even when we don't like it, even when we think we can do other things with our time, but we feel that we're being called by a higher purpose and we go there and we act. That's an active resignation, right? So probably the way they were reading this passage by Elijah was this indifference, this distancing, this apathy for anyone and anything outside our own tribe, outside our own little small community, right?
I think also reading for the days of today could be also the fact that we allow ourselves to be enslaved of our emotions, not be able to educate and control them.
Yeah.
Because if we don't go to the path of knowing ourselves, we become, just one doll in the middle of this whole collective unconscious mind.
Yeah, a slave of our own emotions, right? Not wanting to do self-knowledge, not wanting to go deeper.
We
Right?
need to do whatever is being given to us and presented without to go one
Right.
step further.
Yeah, almost like I had no control over it. I was there, it happened, I had to, this is who I am. This is how I've always been, right? We say this to ourselves, trying to justify behaviors and patterns that we know we need to improve on, but we keep postponing it, right? Teresa?
I was thinking that it was talking about kind of, like being slaves to our passion. Like, getting so caught up in the material of like, what I want, trying to satisfy this, a house, I want money, I want a job, getting, resigning ourselves that's, getting caught, forgetting our spirit.
Yeah. And I think we have a big challenge. We were just talking about this today. The fact that we have chosen, our spirits have chosen to be currently living in a city like New York, which Emmanuel describes this country and this moment we are in our evolution as North America being the seat of the material powers. The seat of material powers. So materiality thrives in this soil for good and not so good. Depends on our willingness to enslave ourselves and go with the flow, or to use the materiality at its most excessive all around us as a gym for the soul to strengthen ourselves. Not to shun, not to isolate ourselves, but live in this reality with all the values, with all of the discrepancies and diversities, and still hold true to what our spirit came here to do in this life, right? And not have this moment where the disciples are in the Garden of Olives in the last moments of being with Jesus and they just can't stay awake. And that's when Jesus says, why can't you keep watch with me for just one more hour? They symbolically sleep. They just can't. They're just like to be in the horizontal state, so to speak, right? So Jesus clarifies what that means. And he says, I bring with me the weapons with which people can fight the enemies who subjugate their hearts. And I will not rest until we are at the threshold of victory. I love the humility of Jesus when he says that. He doesn't have to fight the enemies that are subjugating his heart. He's overcome all of that. But he includes himself in order to feel the empathy of the community, in order to feel like the community is one with them, with him. I bring with me the weapons with which people can fight the enemies who subjugate their hearts. I will not rest until we are at the threshold. In the Portuguese version, it says at the port. So it implies this journey in the ocean until we get to the port of victory, like the safe harbor. Until then, he's not going to rest. That's why right now my cup must overflow with gall. As such are the enormous efforts that our work demands. It is an enormous effort, isn't it? This is a planet of trials and expiations. We are very materialized spirits, and there's nothing wrong with that. We accept that's our current state. But we also recognize that there's a huge amount of resistance to fight against. We are all with a lot of conditioned reflexes that are calling us to our personality, to our material interests, to our passions. And those are still very strong magnetic pulls, right? The fact that we are in a center here doesn't make us immune to these things. We come here to rehearse through repetition, through community, through experience, ways that can strengthen our spirit so that when we leave, we can do a little better. But it's still a hard struggle, and it's an individual, right? So Jesus doesn't stop here. He continues clarifying. And we begin to notice how Zebedee starts to change as he accepts and understands the message, right? So he clarified about that sense of peace and resignation from Elijah. He talks about going a step further. And he says here, serenity of spirits during the battles and the good fight because they rested their thoughts in the loving bosom of God. This is the part that I'm going to read right now. He says, there are powerful men in the world who die comfortably in their palaces without peace in their hearts. So he's describing this peace and resignation that Zebedee made an allusion in Elijah. So they're comfortable in their palaces but die without peace in their hearts. They die in despair and carry with them the dark night in their conscience into the eternity of the lower zones. So all that material comfort doesn't go into the heart and the mind sometimes. And when the spirit goes to the afterlife, it takes all of that anguish within. There are fighters who die in different kinds of battles. Oftentimes they are defeated and humiliated. However, they maintain complete serenity of mind because throughout the good fight, they kept their thoughts on the love of God. So one example that distinguishes from the above, right? Fighting the good fight, and even though we might be defeated and humiliated in the physical world's perspective, if we keep true within our hearts and minds to fighting the good fight and keeping our thoughts on the loving bosom of God, meaning cultivating our faith, cultivating our trust, then we can weather the storm. And I was just talking to Marcelo as we were coming here that we had an amazing insight that Adilson brought to us when we were studying last week. That passage of Jesus, when he is in the boat with the disciples in the Sea of Galilee, and there's a storm that happens, and the boat is rocking back and forth, and the disciples all get terrified, thinking it's going to capsize. And Jesus, what is he doing in that passage? He's down below sleeping. And they go to him and they are desperate. Lord, Lord, we're going to die. So he wakes up and he calms the storm. And then he says, ye of little faith. He gave an insight that I had never thought of. That we always look at this scene as if something from the outside. But what if this boat is us and the Christ in us is sleeping? That's why there's a storm. And when the Christ in us awakens, it can go and immediately calm the storm. And the storm as an illusion, it disappears because the Christ within awakens. That was awesome. That was a great insight. It was like a light bulb that went off, right? So I think he's referring to this situation here of us who go through our fights and our storms and our battles, but we keep the good fight of the faith inside and we cultivate. And then when we do that, we are able to remove the storms of our lives, or at least we're able to deal with them in a way that doesn't make us feel scared of them. We understand that they're there, but we're going to overcome them, right? Now he says, there are others who applaud evil. They present a false attitude of tolerance, but they end up suffering the effects of destruction tomorrow. So applauding evil and presenting a false attitude of tolerance, in a way it's like the false sense of resignation. Yeah, let evil thrive, I'm okay with that. But if we just finish here, we might think that Jesus is inviting the disciples to be police officers of evil out there, right? And he says, the true disciples of the true disciples of the truths of heaven do not approve of wrong, but they don't exterminate those who support them. They work for the good because they know that God is also working for it. The Father does not tolerate evil nor the battle because he loves his children very much. What is this battle that he's talking about? The battle of those who think they have the truth and try to fight with their brothers and sisters who are committing evil. Don't we see that attitude happening a lot? I found Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Now I am going to be saved. So now I have to go out there and make people realize the evil they're committing. And I need to shake them so that they can awaken to the fact that they're going through the wrong path. And that's evil, right? Jesus is saying here, the Father doesn't tolerate the evil or the battle, this type of battle of interfering and trying to go beyond our boundaries of respecting other people's free will, because he loves his children very much. Therefore, you can see, Zebedee, that our kingdom is a place of constant work, which is realized for the good of the whole humanity. And this passage here is a very beautiful example of the generosity of the soul, of the spirit, when we are able to feed each other with the bread of life, the bread of comfort, of the consoler, right? And Pastorino says something very beautiful here. He says, serve through love and love through service. To be able to serve through love and to be able to love through service, to love the service that we do, to love the obligations we have embraced, the duties we have to fulfill, to cultivate those actions with a lot of love. Without that component, it's hard to be a provider of bread and wine, to nourish, to comfort people around, right? People won't feel that they're receiving from us that beautiful spiritual component. And he says here, the cup is the journey that we embrace in our lives of bitterness when we have to fight against the desires of our personality and the material tendencies that pull us away from the conquest of our spiritual autonomy, right? Our spiritual autonomy. So this is a hard fight, but when we are able to reach that spiritual autonomy and don't allow our emotions to enslave us, then we begin to liberate ourselves. That whole idea of liberation has to do with that. We are freeing ourselves from those magnetic pools that drag us down all the time. And Pastorino says that when those have already freed themselves, they are those who forget themselves, those who cease to exist and become bread to feed the hunger of humanity. Physical hunger, intellectual hunger, spiritual hunger. And they transform their blood in the wine of wisdom, the wine of holiness, the wine of love that intoxicates the creatures with the pure beauty and mysticism of Christ's fullness. For they present to all, as the Master did, only the Christ of God, and they disappear from the scenario. His personality, the personality dies so that the Christ can rise in its place. The intellect stays silent so that the diaphanous voice of Christ is risen. The emotions are extinguished so that the love alone of Christ can shine forth. So is when Paul of Tarsus at the end of his ministry has a moment in a letter where he says, it is no longer I who live, but the Christ within me that lives. His personality is gone. He's been able to reach that spiritual autonomy where it's no longer doing anything. It's just the Christ within him that that commands his senses and he obeys with absolute resignation. That's a beautiful milestone for us to achieve. And even in other religious traditions, there is allusions to that state. In the Tao Te Ching, which you guys know I am a big fan, I talk a lot about it, there's a passage that says, the Master does nothing, yet leaves nothing undone. The ordinary man does a lot, but has a lot still to do. What does that mean? The Master does nothing, but leaves nothing undone. The personality does nothing. It just goes with the flow of spiritual inspiration. And because of that, it leaves nothing undone. And the ordinary man, on the other hand, the personality, does a lot. Like we have a huge to-do list every day and the many emails we have to send and the calls and everything. And at the end of the day, oh my God, I still have so much stuff to do, right? Because if I'm able to carry out my day's ordinary obligations with this type of generosity of the bread and the wine, comforting, inspiring people, then I don't need to become a monk or an avatar or a special missionary. I can continue doing my life as it is today, but every single action becomes nourishment, becomes food for the soul of all those around us. So far, so good? So, we are at the moment where the apostles are there staring at Jesus with calm and blissful eyes. And Zebedee is receiving all this information, right? And he contemplates Jesus as the greatest prophet of his people. And then he says, "Great kingdom," exclaimed the old fisherman, radiating enthusiasm that was filling his heart. And then he says to Jesus very blissfully, "Lord, Lord, we will work with you. We will preach your gospel, and we will increase the number of your followers." We will increase the number of your followers. A little bit of a Salome ambition, maybe. We'll increase the number of your followers. What's beautiful is that Jesus can read the emotions, can see the intentions. And so this is the reason why he says the following. "Listen, Zebedee, our cause is not a matter of numbers, but of the truth and of the good. One day, I'm sure this will be the cause of the whole world. But until then, we need to crush the serpent of evil that is under our own feet." Serpent, as another big symbol in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is an animal that drags itself on the ground. It's attached, is bound to the earth. So the serpent of evil is all those things that keeps us bound to the earth. All the desires of matter, all of the emotions that enslave us, that brings us off balance. Until we can't crush that serpent of evil, we can't rise vertically, right? So at the moment, the majority, let me see if I put that. Yeah, he says here, one second, making sure I'm following my own notes. He says, at present, the majority belong to the movements of injustice, lies, and tyranny. They demand armies and kings, swords, and immense wealth to dominate other individuals, right? So those movements require money, require power, require struggle, require violence in order to dominate. On the other hand, he says, love, the essence of all glory in life, needs but a heart and knows how to be happy. Deception claims an endless line of defenders to spread destruction, but it is sufficient to have but one good person to teach the truth of God and to praise his eternal glories, thus comforting the infinite legion of his children. Remember that visual of the bread and the fish being multiplied by thousands when there was only 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? This is also another allusion of the parable of the sower. You guys remember, right? The seed falling all these different types of soils, and then the last seed falls in fertile soil, and it produces an abundant crop, 30, 60, 100 to 1. Meaning, when the seeds of the gospel enter our heart, and at that moment the heart finds itself as a fertile soil, it can do tremendous good. So sometimes in the Spiritist movement and in our house here, we get worried. Oh, we're doing this study and there's only like 2 people that are showing up. Something's wrong. We're doing something wrong. Or the Spiritism exists in the United States for the last 30, 40 years, but it's still so small, right? There's so many little centers. We got to do something that increases the numbers. But is it about quantity? Or is it about a profound transformation of individuals that can then, by a ripple effect, cause a beautiful chain reaction, right? It's not about numbers. So we don't have to be anxious about that. We can rest, relax, and do our part, trusting that the spirit world will find the right areas to make it multiply. Who will be the greatest before God? A crowd who gathers to enthrone tyranny, thus trampling the masses, right? The aggressive, the violent, the revolutionaries, the ones that try to do all these movements that imply violence and stepping on other people's rights and free will? Or a well-intentioned individual who saves a boat full of fishermen with a simple message? It's beautiful because he uses his own background, Zebedee's own background, to make him feel the message, resonate within his heart. He's a fisherman, right? So who is greatest before God in this moment, right? And remember, Humberto de Campos didn't show the whole gospel, but he's making an allusion to his wife Salome when she wanted to put the two children there. Here I want them to be the greatest. So in a very caring, compassionate way, he maybe hints at who would be the greatest before God, you know? And he answers his wife's concern. So he brings now the consolation. He says, when he realizes that it's not about numbers and about changing a lot of people with an accelerated pace, he then asks, Lord, will then the gospel not be good for everyone? So is this a lesson that's not really for everybody? And he replies, in fact, the message of the good news is excellent for everyone. However, not everybody is sufficiently good and fair to accept it. Intellectually and morally, not yet receptive and prepared to receive that message, right? And that goes in the parable of the sower, the different seeds falling into ground where the thorns quash it, or there's no roots because the soil is rocky, so they wither and die when the sun comes out and scorches them, or when the birds come and immediately eat them, right? The message, we understand the message, but our minds are so bombarded by a lot of material distractions that the birds come and eat the seeds away. We forget, we don't remember. It doesn't hold. So he says that's why the gospel brings with it the leaven. Leaven is the yeast that makes the bread rise, of renewal. This too is why I will leave joy and energy as the best weapons for use by my disciple. Joy and energy. That's a reminder for us to really check within ourselves the intentions of what we're doing when we're carrying out our work and our obligations. Are we doing it with joy and with energy? If we're not, let's take a moment to reflect. Let's step back and let's find out what emotions may be getting in the way of us being that bread and that wine for others. What's happening within us? Let's address it. Let's have the sincerity that James and John had. They were simple, they were warm, they were loving, and they were sincere, right? We talk about this. This is a concept I read recently that blew my mind. Emotional honesty. I never saw that in a sentence. Emotional honesty. How often are we emotionally honest about our own emotions? How often do we neglect them and try to put a different facade for the sake of pleasing others, for the sake of being accepted by others, for the sake of making others admire us, right? So in order to check that we're always having that joy and energy so that we can allow the gospel message to constantly renew us with daily enthusiasm, with daily optimism, with daily hope, right? Because after all, let's admit it, who's here on this body, on this life, on vacation? By a show of hands. Anybody's here on vacation? Justin's on vacation. You got to tell us the secret. No one here is on vacation, right? Friends, we're here to work. So, of course, there are the delights, the beauty, the nature that shows an amazing, magnificent Father that allows us to experience this work experience, but it's still not a vacation, right?
Oh,
Yep.
I was going to say that the word energy refers back to the resignation that we were talking about before, because we often think of resignation as, oh well, what could I possibly do against God? Whatever He wants, I'm going to do. But resignation is a participation.
Mm-hmm.
saying that, and that anticipation requires the energy.
Requires energy, right? Resignation requires energy, participation. He says, by exterminating evil and cultivating good, the earth will be a glorious battlefield for us. If a colleague falls in the struggle, it was evil that fell, not our brother or sister, who for us will always be standing. So no matter what a brother or sister does, that can be the most aggressive, oppressive, violent, outrageous thing, it's evil that falls, not our brother or sister. In our eyes of compassion, in our eyes of tenderness and of mercy, we see a brother or sister always standing. It's very beautiful when he says here. Yep.
I don't know if it was by coincidence, but it was so well chosen in your picture. I was thinking about joy and grace, looking at this picture. How easy it is for us to reconnect with the divine in us when you see the beauty of nature, the beauty of music, the beauty of so many things surrounding us. And energy, the sun, in a sense of prayer, the connection with the Almighty.
I picked this image because of the word renewal, right? Reminds us that the sun rises every single day. So we have a chance. Every single day we can renew ourselves, start from scratch. So it's comforting, right? But remember when Jesus said, we will quash the evil in our hearts, and I will not rest until we are at the threshold of victory. He includes himself in it. He says the same thing here in a very beautiful way. We will not rest until the final day of victory. We will not fall to a false conception of God while on the way, because the Father will speak to us through all of the people who will be brought to the good path. We will be together during the storm, because this is when his voice will manifest itself more strongly. This is so comforting, right? We feel we're abandoned in the midst of the storm. It is at this time that the Father speaks to us more strongly, manifests itself more strongly. We will rejoice during the times of temporary pain and loss, because during those moments, his loving heart will say, "Come, my son, I am with you in your sufferings, with the light of my teachings." We will fight the gods of easy triumph, because we know that the work of the world belongs to God. We. It's very inclusive. Understanding his wisdom summons us to complete it. So it has to do with intellectual awareness as well. Building his kingdom of eternal happiness in the depths of our heart. So that is a lot of information to wrap our brains around. And I can only imagine being in Simon Peter's home with little James and John, very young, under the protection of their father Zebedee, having a very early conversation about the gospel. This is the day after the very, very first preaching. There's still an entire 3 years of ministry to unfold before. I can only imagine the enthusiasm, the magnetic energy that Jesus is emanating to Zebedee and to all of those present, and how much powerful that must be to encourage them, right? At this moment, the narrative of Humberto de Campos says, Jesus remained silent for a short time. So this moment of silence we see also in Jesus in the home and other passages. Jesus used this tool of silence very wisely and very often, so as to allow the listener to digest, to reflect. James and John, when he was silent, they drew near, magnetized by his powerful and affectionate gaze. Remember, it reminds me of that song, Lord, in my eyes you were gazing, kindly smiling, my name you were saying, right? It's a very beautiful song that makes us an intimate connection with God. Unable to resist his own emotions, Zebedee closed his eyes, his chest swelling with joy. At that moment, he understood that this establishment of this kingdom had nothing to do with the material one, had everything to do with the spiritual one. So his spirit was transported, almost in a state of ecstasy. Before him, he saw a vast spiritual future We're almost done, guys. Promise. The kingdom of Jesus unfolding to infinity. His personality in this moment is completely idle, silent. It's his spirit that's doing all of this ecstatic state. He seemed to hear the voice of Abraham. Of course, imagine the spiritual atmosphere around the house of Simon Peter, the thousands and thousands of elevated spirit beings all around. How it must have felt like, the energy of the environment, right? He seemed to hear the voice of Abraham and the great echo of his tremendous posterity, the echo of the voice of Abraham, and how it was a tremendous multiplication, right? Everybody blessed the Master in a glorifying hymn. He was having a spiritual vision. His senses were not at that moment inside the body. He was having mediumistic appreciation of the moment. Until then, his old heart only knew about the rigid and feared law of Jehovah, which sounded like the voice of thunder on the brambles of fire. Jesus revealed to him a loving father and friend to his children, even James and John. One who welcomes the old, the humble, and the unfortunate, always with an everlasting expression of kindness. The eyes of the old fisher of Capernaum began to tear, as though swelling from his chest, and he knelt down in front of Jesus. He was in a state of ecstasy. He was completely transported as having received the message. And Jesus, realizing this, he anticipates Zebedee and he pushes him up and says, Zebedee, stand up. The children of God live standing up for the good fight. Then, entering the small room, the father of the apostles took the right hand of the Master and moistened it with his tears of happiness and gratitude, whispering, Lord, my children are yours. He's giving his blessing. Can we imagine that moment for a second? A father, patriarch, noble, fulfilling his obligations, at that moment relinquishing. These children are no longer mine. They are yours. Jesus gently appealed to Zebedee's heart, patted his white hair. So in a moment of embrace, right? In a moment of profound connection, and I'm sure the healing of it, the renewal in that moment in his heart, he said, cry, Zebedee, because your tears today are beautiful and blessed. You feared God, but now you love him. You were lost in your human reasoning regarding laws. Now you have in your heart the fountain of living faith. And it's a moment for us too to remember, how fearful are we of God? Thanks to the understanding we get from Spiritism, I think that for most of us, we no longer fear God. But do we fear one another? Are we hesitant when we talk to each other? Do we feel insecure about our own potentialities and what people are going to think, are going to say to us? I do. I'm extremely insecure. I'm extremely doubtful, hesitant. So I think this is an extension to us. If we don't fear God because we understand him as an infinitely loving and merciful Father and also just, then what do we have to fear in each other when we are interacting with one another? Are we able to be the way that James and John were? Warm, loving, simple, and sincere. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of trust and faith to be 100% sincere with our emotions and our feelings. And that's something I would like to leave for us as a one final reflection. In our own community, for us to strive as much as possible to overcome the fear of being rejected, the fear of even hurting somebody else's feelings by not confronting them. If something comes, something happens, let us have the courage of sincerity to approach the person eye to eye as soon as possible and not postpone. Because when we postpone, we're acting out of that sense of resignation, which is an addiction. It's a fear. It's an indifference. It's a, you know. But meanwhile, our thoughts are thinking it. Our heart is feeling it. And the target of those thoughts and feelings is receiving it. So conflict is something for us to embrace with joy, with energy, I feel. Conflict is not something for us to run away from. We've learned enough through the gospel to have the opportunity to practice it when we are in the midst of conflict. How do we embrace conflict? In the sense of something happened with us. We approach the person with respect, with compassion, but we are sincere. We externalize. We express to them what happened. Look, you hurt me when you said that. I was very offended. That was very hurtful. That's not being selfish. That's not being prideful. That's being honest. And the person is given an opportunity to respond. Because what happens a lot of the time, related to the cup of bitterness that he talks about, how often are the missionaries and the followers of the message of Jesus and other missionaries, how often are they slandered? How often gossip proliferates around them and gives them a wrong idea of what they're doing, who they are? It's all based on speculation, on hearsay, right? Because what happens most of the time is an encounter takes place, and then I go behind her back and I start talking with the person. And there's a yeast that rises here. That person is receiving all of that. Rather, if we can approach the person and have a healthy conflict that gets resolved in a very beautiful way, then it's done. Disconnect ourselves, we immediately are able to forgive, and we go on. So this is just a reminder for us to embrace this idea of conflict. It takes energy, it takes joy, it takes courage, it takes determination. And it takes a little bit of overcoming fears within ourselves. Fears of being rejected, insecurity, all these things that we talked about. Let's have the integrity and the sincerity to approach people eye to eye, here in our community, outside our community, in our family, so that we can address, while we're still here, these things that linger in the air. Little resentments, little bitternesses. Do you resonate with that? Do you guys agree, Thelma? Thelma? Okay. So I just love this little last image here as the birth of the Christ within us. As we study the gospel and as we internalize the teachings and we keep walking the journey, fighting the good fight, with our spirits connected with our faith, we slowly but surely are able to appease the animals of our personality and make them become domesticated and at the service of the Christ within, allowing this Christ to grow, to thrive, and take over our personality so that we can fulfill as much as possible we came here to fulfill with joy and with energy. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your time, for your attention, and ask us to go to the passes.